You did not sign up to fight zombies, and yet here you are. You are a responder, a volunteer, someone who saw a public health emergency developing in 2027 and signed up for the Civil Recovery Corps because the government was offering tax credits and other benefits to healthy civilians willing to fill understaffed jobs during the Kulon pandemic. A deer hunter, a hockey player, a reserve military member, a vice president of a company that probably does not exist anymore. Ordinary people who raised their hands and said yes to what sounded like a reasonable request during an unreasonable situation, and then the dead started getting back up. The organization that sent them in, the one ultimately responsible for deploying volunteers into zombie infested American cities with whatever weapons they can find on the ground, has a word buried in its official mandate that changes everything about how you understand what the Homeland Emergency Response Agency actually is. That word is violently. This is the full story of the Homeland Emergency Response Agency, what it actually is, how it was formed, why the Civil Recovery Corps exists separately from it, what its real mandate says about how the US government was approaching the Kulon crisis, and what all of it tells you about the world you are walking into every time you deploy as a responder. If you have never played the game or watched any previous video in this series, everything gets explained as we go. The name alone tells you something important before any of the details do. The Homeland Emergency Response Agency, not the Federal Emergency Management Agency that existed before it. The Homeland Emergency Response Agency. And the difference between those two names is not bureaucratic reshuffling. It is a statement about what the organization was designed to do differently from what came before. The Homeland Emergency Response Agency is a subsidiary of the United States Department of Homeland Security. It was formed by militarizing the Federal Emergency Management Agency, rather than dismantling it and building something new. The decision was not to replace the emergency management infrastructure that already existed, but to change what that infrastructure was allowed to do and how aggressively it was allowed to do it. The Federal Emergency Management Agency's mandate was emergency management, relief, recovery, coordination of resources during disasters. The Homeland Emergency Response Agency kept all of that and added something the Federal Emergency Management Agency never had: the explicit authority to respond to disasters and public health emergencies violently if necessary. An emergency response organization that can legally use force against the civilian population it is supposed to be protecting is a fundamentally different kind of institution from a relief agency. It does not stop being a relief agency, but that authority changes what it is capable of becoming when the situation demands it. And the Kulon outbreak created exactly the kind of situation where that authority would be used. During the Kulon outbreak, the Homeland Emergency Response Agency's primary role was enforcing quarantines, not suggesting them, not coordinating voluntary compliance with quarantine recommendations, enforcing them, which in the context of a mandate that explicitly includes violent response means the agency was authorized to physically prevent people from leaving quarantine zones, whether they agreed to stay or not. It was also setting up hospitals and relief camps and protecting the personnel of the National Institutes for Disease Control, the federal medical research organization that Dr. David Mead worked for when he first identified the Kulon virus in 2025. The National Institutes for Disease Control itself was formed when the CDC and the National Institutes of Health merged during the pandemic, combining the two most significant disease research organizations in the country into one under the pressure of the crisis. And this is the part that genuinely unsettles me when I think about it. The Homeland Emergency Response Agency was not just managing the public response to the outbreak. It was actively protecting the scientists studying it, which means the people with the most knowledge about what the Kulon virus actually was and how it worked were operating under armed protection from an agency with a mandate to respond violently. The scientists knew things the public did not. The agency was making sure they stayed safe enough to keep knowing them. What exactly they knew and what the Homeland Emergency Response Agency knew as a result of protecting them is something the lore raises without fully answering. Now, look at the Civil Recovery Corps because this is where the story of who you actually are gets genuinely interesting. You are not an employee of the Homeland Emergency Response Agency. You are not military. You are not a trained emergency responder in any formal sense. You are a member of the Civil Recovery Corps. The Civil Recovery Corps was formed through an executive order of the Department of Health and Human Services in 2027 when the Homeland Emergency Response Agency and the National Institutes for Disease Control were severely struggling to manage the scale of what the Kulon pandemic had become. The idea was straightforward: a grassroots volunteer organization that would coordinate healthy civilians willing to fill understaffed jobs during the public health emergency. Tax credits as incentive, other benefits as encouragement, a way to mobilize ordinary people for ordinary tasks that the overwhelmed formal response organizations could not cover. A deer hunter volunteered to help with supply runs. A hockey player volunteered to assist at a relief camp. A vice president volunteered because their company had collapsed, and the Civil Recovery Corps was something useful to do. None of them were told they would end up as a ragtag zombie fighting task force. And then the dead started getting back up, and the Civil Recovery Corps chapters organized across every state suddenly found themselves doing something nobody had trained them for, equipped them for, or warned them was a possibility when they signed their volunteer paperwork. The gap between what you signed up for and what you are actually doing is the most honest thing. No more room in hell 2 says about how disaster response actually works. You are not a hero. You were not selected for this. You did not go through a special program that identified you as uniquely capable of handling what the Kulon outbreak became. You raised your hand at the right time, and the situation changed around you faster than anyone could adapt to. The responders in this game do not have military training by default. They have backgrounds. A deer hunter has skills that happen to be useful in an environment where moving quietly and conserving ammunition matter. A reserve military member has training that carries over better than most. A hockey player is physically capable in ways that help when things get close and desperate. Skills shaped by ordinary lives that now have applications nobody anticipated. And they are working for an organization through the Civil Recovery Corps that is ultimately answering to the Homeland Emergency Response Agency, an agency enforcing quarantines with the authority to do so violently, an agency protecting scientists who knew more about the Kulon virus than the public did. You volunteered to help during a health crisis. You ended up as the operational arm of a militarized emergency response agency in the middle of a zombie apocalypse. What the Homeland Emergency Response Agency is not telling you is the question worth sitting with as you play through the maps and complete the objectives and extract when the window opens. The mandate says respond violently if necessary. But necessary by whose judgment exactly? An agency operating under emergency powers that the Kulon outbreak almost certainly expanded significantly gets to decide what necessary means. And that is a significant amount of discretion for an organization that was already authorized to use force before the dead started walking. The quarantine enforcement means the agency had the authority and the willingness to keep people inside infected zones, whether they wanted to stay or not, which means some of the people in those zones were not there by choice. The protection of National Institutes for Disease Control personnel means the Homeland Emergency Response Agency had access to scientific information about the virus that was not being shared with the general public, what they knew about what was coming, whether anyone in the formal response chain knew the reanimation mutation was possible before it happened, whether they chose not to act in time or simply could not. None of those questions have confirmed answers, but an organization that can use force, that enforced quarantines, that protected scientists with information the public did not have, and that deployed civilian volunteers into active zombie zones to complete objectives has made a lot of decisions it has never fully explained to the people carrying out those decisions on the ground. The responders going into those maps do not have the full picture. They probably never did. That is what the Homeland Emergency Response Agency actually is: a militarized emergency response agency formed by pushing the Federal Emergency Management Agency further than it was designed to go, an organization whose mandate explicitly includes violent response to public health emergencies, an agency that enforced quarantines, protected scientists, and ultimately deployed civilian volunteers through the Civil Recovery Corps into situations those volunteers never agreed to when they signed up. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next in this series. Because Iceland, being the only safe place on Earth, and why the US government relocated there, is the next question this series needs to answer. And drop a comment. The Homeland Emergency Response Agency's mandate explicitly includes responding to public health emergencies violently. Does knowing that change how you think about the organization you are working for every time you deploy as a responder? Because I find that word sitting in an emergency relief mandate genuinely unsettling the more I think about what it actually authorizes. Tell me what you think.